Dear students of my department, I am doing this recording because we all are stuck at home given the situation emerging out of this spread of coronavirus. Okay, I will do today Great Expectation with you. Great Expectations, as you know, is one of Dickens's great novels written over a period of 1 year, that is from 1860 to 1861, and the novel was published uh, in 1861, but before that it was serialized over a period of 1 year, as I told you, uh, in a magazine called All the Year Round. Now I will talk today, um, or I will focus on the critical summary of the novel, that is Great Expectations. And after that, I will also focus on the various aspects related to this great expectation. I mean, in other words, what is this great expectation about? Now, let's start. First, a critical summary of the novel, because unless and until, as I feel, you know the storyline, it's very hard for you to have an understanding of the critical issues. So first, take a look at the storyline. Or before the storyline, just take a look at Dickens as a novelist. Now, Dickens, not just in Victorian England, but in all periods and perhaps of all literature, Charles Dickens remains a towering figure, not just as a great storyteller, but he was a storyteller with a social zeal. Now, why I say this has a reason. I'll talk about that later on in my in this soundtrack. Now, Charles Dickens's full name was Charles John Huffam Dickens. He spent the happiest period of his boyhood in Chatham, which is in England, and this was followed by a period of intense misery which deeply affected him, and during which time his father was imprisoned for huge debt, and he himself, when he was only 12 years old, worked in a blacking warehouse or in a shoe factory to support himself and the family. Now, much of his fiction, which was written later, was partly inspired by his personal experience of life, and partly with a reformist bent of mind. We have to keep in mind that the great we have to keep in mind that the great Victorian period was also a period of some great reformation. Remember, the first reformist bill was passed in 1832 when Dickens was 20 years of age. Dickens captured, as some critics have held, the popular imagination as no other novelist had done, and despite some hue and cry, some murmurs against his sensationalism and sentimentality, against the portrayal of his sensationalism and sentimentality, and his inability to portray women other than as innocents or grotesques. That means some critics have argued that Dickens has portrayed women either as innocents or as grotesque creatures. He could not go beyond these two compartmentalizations. But Dickens was also held in high critical esteem, admired. He was highly admired by contemporaries as Queen Victoria and and none other than Dostoevsky, that Russian author. But it was not until the 20th century that he began to attract serious academic attention. So this is very important. So when Dickens, as we know, is a Victorian writer, is a late 19th century or 19th century writer, but he did not get critical attention in the academic field until the coming of 20th century. He wrote in total 15 novels. One was unfinished, of course, among which The Great Expectation remains one of his best. And this was published, as I told you, in 1861. Like many of Dickensian's novels, Great Expectation, which was written, as I told you, between 1860 and 1861 and serialized in All the Year Round, basically charts the growth and development of a hero called Philip Pirrip, or popularly known as Pip. Philip Pirrip or Pip. Now, who was this Pip? Pip was a village boy brought up by his termagant sister, Mrs. Joe, and she was the wife of the gentle, humorous, kind-hearted blacksmith Joe Gargery. Now, Pip is introduced to the house of Miss Havisham. This is how the storyline goes. Pip is introduced to the house of Miss Havisham by Mr. Joe Gargery, his brother-in-law. And this Miss Havisham was a lady who was half crazed because he was deserted by her lover on her bridal night. And that's why this Miss Havisham has developed within herself a kind of attitude of revenge towards the males, because she is under the impression that no male can be good. Now, in the house of Miss Havisham lives a girl called Estella. Now, when Pip goes to the house of Miss Havisham, accompanied by Mr. Joe, his brother-in-law, Pip gets to meet this Estella. Now, Miss Havisham has brought up this Estella. Estella lives in the house of Miss Havisham. Estella lives in the house of Miss Havisham as an adopted daughter. And Miss Havisham has brought up the girl Estella to use her beauty as a means of torturing men. So Estella actually serves as an instrument of Miss Havisham in order to inflict torture on the sterner sex of society. Pip falls in love with Estella, almost, you may call it, this is a love at first sight, and aspires to become a gentleman. Later on, money and expectations of more wealth come to him from a mysterious source. We'll talk about that later on, which he believes to be Miss Havisham. Now, Pip believes that his real benefactress is Miss Havisham, who is financing Pip in order to become a gentleman, in order to achieve the status of a gentleman. He goes to London, and in his new mode of life, in his new avatar of life, meanly abandons the devoted Joe Gargery. Now, when Pip goes to London, he forgets his brother-in-law, good-hearted brother-in-law. But as time goes on, Pip entangles himself with huge amount of debt, and he is accompanied by his close ally and friend Herbert, and misfortunes start to come upon Pip. As the narrative progresses, it is revealed that the real benefactor, the name of his benefactor, is an escaped convict by the name of Abel Magwitch. Now, this same Magwitch is the person who, when the novel opens, who Pip had helped. When the novel opens in chapter number 1, we see a person who is extremely hungry, who is extremely tired, who is almost exhausted to the point of death. Now Pip meets him in the marshland, and Magwitch asks for food and file. Uh, I mean, almost Magwitch terrifies Pip to bring food and file for himself, for Magwitch. Now Pip brings food, I mean, steals food from the kitchen of his sister and brings food to Magwitch. Now Magwitch remembers this. Although Magwitch was a convict, Magwitch remembers this, and later on, Magwitch helps uh, Peep to become a gentleman. But as time progresses, Peep's great expectations fade away, and he 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 is rendered penniless. Estella, who with whom Peep fell in love at first sight almost, marries a man called Drumley. There are two characters, Drumley and Startup. We'll talk about that later on. By whom he is cruelly ill-treated. Now, Peep is taught, as Peep is taught by adversity, Peep returns to Joe Garganian honest labor and is finally reunited to Estella, who has also learned her lesson. Now, this is the storyline in a nutshell, where you will find Peep, Abel Magwitch, Mr. Joe, Mrs. Joe, Mr. Jaggers, the lawyer from London, who brings the good news that Peep would be helped by an unknown benefactor. These are the main characters of the story. Rather than these characters, these notable characters, there are Uncle Pumblechook, Wemmick, and other characters. When we will do character study, we will talk about that later on. Let us now focus on this aspect of great expectation. What is this great expectation about? I mean, what the title tells us. Now, structurally speaking, the entire storyline is divided into 3 volumes. And these 3 volumes contain 59 chapters. The first volume contains 19 chapters, and the next 2 volumes contains 20 chapters each. Each volume ends with a message which turns out to be very significant, in line with the title of the novel. As the first volume comes to an end, the author adds, and this is very significant. Now, as the first volume comes to an end, the author adds, and I quote, "This is the first stage of Pepys' expectations." And the next 2 volumes follow suit. I repeat, this is the first stage of Pepys' expectations. Now, this is very significant. Indeed, Pep, the protagonist, has expectations which are multi-layered, which are many-folded. Just like the author himself, the upbringing of Pep is marked by humbleness and simplicity. Pep was an orphan, and he was raised, as I told you, by the blacksmith, Mr. Joe, and his sister, Mrs. Joe. But as he grows up, unexpected turns confront him, pushing him further into an apparently upward social mobility, by which Pip keeps on getting happier all the time. Now we will look what are the turns. Look at those turns, those unexpected turns that come to confront Pip. The first such turn comes when he gets to meet Estella in Miss Havisham's house. Pip is led to believe that Miss Havisham wills to marry off Pip with Estella, with whom he falls in love, although the lady in question, that is Estella, continuously maltreats Pip in every step. The next turn is really a surprise When Pip gets to hear from an unknown man called Mr. Jagger. This Mr. Jagger is none other than a lawyer from London. He is very influential in London. That somebody wants to make Pip a true gentleman. And this happens in chapter number 18. This happens in chapter number 18. Pip is described by this stranger as having great expectations. Now, this is again very important. And let me quote from chapter number 18. As soon as Pip hears this, Pip reacts thus. And I quote Pip says, "My dream was out. My wild fancy was surpassed by sober reality. Miss Havison was going to make my fortune on a grand scale." Now we will understand later on that we will see later on that this Pip's realization that Miss Havison is his real benefactress is a false one, right? Now let me quote another thing from this chapter 18, the words of this lawyer, that is Mr. Jagger. Now let me quote, "Now I return to this young fellow, and the communication I have got to make is that he has great expectations." Now hearing this, Joe and Pip gasped and looked at each other. Again I quote, Jagger says, "I am instructed to communicate to him that he will come into a handsome property. Further, that it is the desire of the present possessor of that property that he be immediately removed from his present sphere of life and from this place, and be brought up as a gentleman. In a word, as a young fellow of great expectations." Mark the phrase great expectations. Now, as soon as Pip hears, Pip says, as I quoted earlier, "My dream was out. My wild fancy was surpassed by sober reality. Miss Havisham was going to make my fortune on a grand scale." Thus Pip's journey begins. Pip's journey from a boy of humble origin begins to take an upward turn, and Pip lands himself in London, where he finds the Pocket family to be his benefactors. He lives with the Pocket family and he finds their Herbert. But the person who finances Pip remains shrouded in mystery still. All the Pip thinks that his real benefactor or benefactress is none other than Miss Havisham herself. One important incident happens when Pip is in London. He visits his brother-in-law once in his hometown. Now this happens after Pip has spent considerable amount of time in London, and this happens in chapter number 28. Now Pip gets a message from his hometown, and Pip visits. Pip is told to visit the house of Miss Havisham. Now, when Pip goes to visit the house of Miss Havisham, which is in his hometown, he also goes to his brother-in-law. But instead of staying with his brother-in-law's house, Pip hires a room in a local inn called Blue Boar. Now, Pip thinks that Pip's present status that he has achieved staying in London will not match with the status of the blacksmith, that is Joe and his wife. That's why Pip stays or prefers to stay in a room in a local inn called Blue Boar. And Pip also thinks that if he stays in a local inn called Blue Boar, in that local inn called Blue Boar, he will be able to impress Estella. So that's how Pip is, kind of having an illusion. And Pip, the more Pip goes through his life, the more he is driven into that illusion. The London life for Pip gradually proves to be an extravagant one, and Pip begins to spend more and more money, which surpasses his income, uh, and he is accompanied by Herbert. Both of them engage in a kind of luxurious lifestyle. This luxurious lifestyle actually incurs huge amount of debt, and both Pip and Herbert uh, surrendered themselves into a huge amount of debt. And in his 21st birthday, Pip gets an assurance from Mr. Jaggers. You remember Mr. Jagger as a lawyer, an influential lawyer in London, that he will get £500 every year for his sustenance. But this assurance of £500 also proves to be of no real help in the long run, because Pip ultimately returns to his good-hearted Joe's house to find peace and solace of mind. So even after the fact that Pip gets the assurance of £500 in his 21st birthday from Mr. Jagger, the lawyer, Pip can't use that money to his good effect. So Pip's great expectation of having made himself a rich dandy in London also gets dashed and shattered. So first, Pip's great expectation of harboring Estella as its lady love is shattered to pieces, because Estella later on marries a man called Drumley. And secondly, Pip's great expectation of making himself a rich man in London, a cultured dandy in London, also gets shattered. Now, the real benefactor of Pip, it turns out in the course of the narrative, is none other than the man who Pip had helped with food and file, as it is stated in chapter number 1. That escaped convict called Abel Magwitch. The aspiration of Magwitch to make Pip a gentleman also falls flat. This is another dimension of great expectation, that Magwitch also expected Pip to be a gentleman as he started helping Pip, but this also falls on flat surface. Estella's aspiration to continuously hate and maltreat Pip does not last long, because the novel ultimately has a happy kind of ending where Pip meets Estella, and it is hinted that they go on living happily ever after. So Estella's great expectation, or Estella's expectation to continuously hate and maltreat Pip, also falls on flat surface. And with that also falls on flat surface the expectation of Miss Havisham, who, as I told you, brought up his adopted Estella in order to inflict pain and torture on the sterner sex of society. But you have to remember, along with this, that not all aspirations are dashed and shattered to pieces. Not all aspirations, not all expectations in the novel are dashed to pieces and shattered, because we really get to see some positive aspects, some positive sides of these of expectations. For example, Pip's aspiration to help Herbert. I told you that both Pip and Herbert incurred huge amount of debt while they are in London. Pip actually planned or aspired to help Herbert in his testing time. That's why Pip actually invested some good amount of money with a shipping broker called Cleriker, with a contract that this Cleriker, the shipping broker, would need money, and in near future would also need a partner in his business. Now Pip gets the assurance from this Cleriker that when Cleriker would employ a partner, he would employ Herbert. And later on we really get to see that Herbert getting a job with this shipping broker. Now this has a parallel, as Pip was this incident of Pip having helped Herbert, his close ally and friend, has a parallel in the story, because you will see that we have seen that Pip was helped by an unknown benefactor called, we have seen that later on to be Abel Magwitch, that escaped convict. Similarly here also Herbert is being helped by Pip, and this happens without Herbert knowing it, that Pip is helping Herbert. So this has a kind of parallel. So another good aspect or another positive side of this great expectation is the kind-hearted Joe, whose trust and goodwill pays off when ultimately Pip returns to Joe's smithy and Joe's house and stays with his brother-in-law. Pip's secret wish to win over Estella. I told you that Pip almost fell in love with, fell in love with Estella at first sight, and Pip from then on harbored a kind of secret desire to marry Estella, but that did not happen. But ultimately, it happens. Pip's secret wish to win over Estella was once a fantasy based on unreal values and you may say cultural snobbishness. But that same Pip comes to Estella and they get married. But they get married not before both Pip and Estella go through what may be called their purgatorial period. I mean, it's not before Estella has learned her mistakes and has learned a lesson of life, and it's not before Pip also goes through ups and downs of his life and comes to a realization which is mature. And towards the end of the novel, towards the end of the narrative, in the last chapter, we see that Pip and Estella getting reunited. So that's how you may say the novel is really a novel of aspiration. The novel is really a tale of aspiration. And this aspiration, as I told you, as I described, uh, has many dimensions. I stop here. In my next lecture, I will focus on some other aspects. Thank you.